So because I had to take a few days off to work on some stuff around my house, today you're getting one of those extra long connecting the dots videos. So buckle up, and if you can, please go ahead and first share this video on your social media. That would really help as well. So thank you for that. Let's get started. If you want to understand the underlying economic background to what's really happening right now, especially with respect to just how expensive things are becoming, check out my interview with financial commentator Ernst Wolf from April 13th of 2020, all the way back then. Inflation and indeed hyperinflation were always on the cards because the financial system was due to collapse anyway. COVID and the Ukraine-Russia war are simply the perfect cover stories. Indeed, the diesel, petrol and home heating oil prices are increasing exponentially. World Bank and IMF loans given to countries to support them during the COVID lockdowns managed to delay the economic devastation that was on its way, and now the process can truly begin, with the war narrative being used as justification. So gas and oil are no longer coming from Russia, and the energy crisis we've been predicting for 2 years is finally here. It's truly sad and indeed utter insanity that Joe Normie believes that it's worth it to pay extra at the gas station if it means sticking it to Vladimir Putin. Yeah, I'm sure he's terrified. All the while people's standard of living and ability to heat their homes and fuel their cars is becoming ever more difficult. So, on one hand, we have World Economic Forum puppet Putin versus World Economic Forum puppet Zelensky, and it sure is a big coincidence that the practical outcome of this war is that the decline in our quality of living and the emergence of hyperinflation just so happen to be in line with the final phase of economic collapse needed to usher in Klaus Schwab's Great Reset. Gargantuan fuel prices will lead to considerable knock-on effects, such as rising food prices, which was always inevitable. Since as far back as 2018, I was talking about how food shortages were on the way. It was telegraphed back when there was a sudden surge in the mainstream media of stories about how we were expected to eat bugs and stop eating meat for climate change. All the while, the increases in oil prices will only further serve to affect supply chains across a wide range of sectors. Let's move on. This article is from the Irish Times. Ireland may take in more than 100,000 Ukrainian refugees, Minister says. We don't want another Calais. It is important to keep that flow of people moving, Anne Rabbitt says. 100,000? Why not 1 million? I mean, it's not like Ireland can't house the entire planet or anything. As to how many of those people will actually be Ukrainian is anyone's guess. I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being a lot like that other manufactured migrant crisis from 2015 when millions of non-Syrians entered Europe. So, little Ireland with its 5 million population, 1/5 of which is already foreign-born, is now expected to take in another 100,000 people, which is a number about the size of the population of Limerick City, and these new arrivals will receive state welfare. This article is from KildareNow.com. Ukrainians fleeing war will receive social welfare payments in Ireland. The announcement, following a temporary protection directive put in place by the European Union to allow Ukrainian citizens and others fleeing Ukraine to move through the EU as EU citizens. Ireland's Department of Social Protection today, Monday, March 7th, confirmed support and services will be provided for Ukrainian refugees. In guidance published today, the government has advised the procurement of a PPS number in order to access public services and social welfare benefits. Incredible. We're economically doomed here, and demographically perhaps in an even worse situation. Never mind the fact that there's a generation of young and now middle-aged Irish people unable to buy their own house and struggling to get a mortgage. Never mind the fact that we already have 10,000 homeless people in this country. Let's just give benefits and housing to another 100,000 total strangers. We can't claim to be able to sufficiently take care of the people currently living in Ireland, but somehow we're going to be able to accommodate an additional 100,000 people. Nothing about this situation is supposed to make sense or be in any way sustainable. We are in free fall here. This crisis is simply designed to break our nations and destroy our ability to resist the totalitarian prison state that the globalists have planned for us. Our taxes are going to have to go through the roof to pay for all of this at a time when a manufactured food and energy crisis is just beginning. I highly recommend you follow Wayne, the professor of right, on Telegram, and I believe he's on other platforms as well. You can find him on Odyssey. He's a great political and social commentator, and I think he's made an excellent observation about all of this. What we're going through right now looks like an attempt to impoverish us to such a degree that people will accept universal basic income, which is obviously universal basic poverty for all. You can have food rations and access to your new, highly controlled digital currency, but you'll have to agree to accept the government's new terms of service for life. Carbon scores, social credit systems, digital identity, mandatory medications, etc. Humanity is being reduced to little more than cattle, the property of the cabal. And where exactly will these 100,000 people be housed? Well, the Irish Examiner had this story. Irish families will have to open their homes to Ukrainian refugees. Huh. Will they now? You know, I find all of this very interesting for two important reasons. Number one, the Right to Housing Bill, which will be voted on in a referendum, and number two, the 2022 Irish Census. More on that in a moment. First, a reminder as to the Right to Housing Bill. I covered this in a video on September 7th of 2020. Here's a clip from that video, which was called Ireland and the Loss of Private Property Rights. 39th Amendment of the Constitution. Right to Housing Bill 2020. And it's really interesting. It says, the state in particular recognises the common good as including the right to secure affordable, dignified housing appropriate to need for all the residents of Ireland and shall guarantee this right through its laws, policies and the prioritisation of resources. The state accordingly shall delimit the right to private property where it is necessary to ensure the common good, whatever that is, and to vindicate the said right to housing for all residents of Ireland. So there's a lot to unpack here. The state, in particular, recognises the common good as including the right to secure affordable, dignified housing, appropriate to need for all the residents of Ireland, and shall guarantee this right through its laws, policies, and the prioritisation of resources. So let's take that first part. The Marxist-type language of appropriate to need stands out there for me, because appropriate to need is entirely subjective. It sounds very much like that Marxist slogan, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Just like dignified housing and common good. What does dignified housing actually mean? And common good, well, that's just pure collectivist language there. Communist tyranny is often justified under common good. For all residents of Ireland is also concerning, as it doesn't say all citizens of Ireland. So anyone living here will be entitled to a home. That's quite a promise for a state to make, isn't it? Shall guarantee this right through its laws, policies, and the prioritisation of resources. So the prioritisation of resources could be interpreted in many ways. This is very broad and open-ended, especially when you see the next paragraph. The state accordingly shall delimit the right to private property where it is necessary to ensure the common good, who gets to determine the common good though, and to vindicate the said right to housing for all residents of Ireland. Delimit. That's a very concerning word, meaning the potential for restrictions of people's property rights. Could this also mean land seizures, the confiscation of private property like we see in China, in order for property to be repurposed for the common good? Oh, you've got a large home there, I see. Or you're sitting on half an acre of land. We really need that site in order to turn it into high-density housing. I mean, do you need to live in a two-story home anymore? You have all that space. Other people need a place to live, you know. Make no mistake, this is softening people up for gradual erosion of private property rights. This is a right to housing bill. It's not a bill about the right to owning your own private home. A right to housing just means that a person has a right to be housed somewhere. It doesn't mean that they have a right to own a house or an apartment of their very own. We know from Agenda 2030 that globalists don't want people owning their own homes. Remember that World Economic Forum article? I own nothing, I have no privacy, and life has never been better? This bill, of course, would have to be passed in a referendum, and you can only imagine the kind of propaganda that they will use. You know, it's all about equality and a home for everyone. Do you remember that video in San Francisco? It was a CNN report, I believe, of these young people living in pods. Shared flophouse accommodation with no privacy. Yeah, I can imagine this leading to that kind of a situation. A right to housing would literally mean little more than a right to a roof over your head. In my view, this bill is simply good old-fashioned communism, wealth and land redistribution, and it's once again sold under the guise of human rights. But the issue that I can see is that a bill like this will likely sail past the post in a referendum because the people will be taken in by the sloganeering and the propaganda, and also because buying a house has become so difficult. Also, rent has become so exorbitant. So young people who can't get on the property ladder right now will beg for something like this. But let's not talk about the actual reason that buying a house has become so expensive, which is to say uncontrolled mass immigration driving wages down and increasing demand for property. Let's instead just give people a right to housing, which is to say they will be completely dependent upon the state for a home, just as the plan is to make them completely dependent upon the state for their universal basic income. They will be reduced to being essentially employees of the state. When the government is providing your home and your income, you'd better not speak out about the government, just in case you lose both your home and your income. The government will, after all, own the dwelling you reside in. I can foresee the rise of terms like shared community spaces and common living areas. Under communism, private property is abolished, and people receive only the bare minimum of what they need, which is why communism always leads to catastrophic levels of poverty, social unrest, and starvation. It's my view that the current housing crisis was manufactured over the past few decades in order to create that problem reaction solution framework that enables bills like this to get passed. The public will become so desperate for anything that looks on paper like a solution that they will sacrifice their own right to private property in order for future generations to live in government-owned slums and shared accommodations. We know that Agenda 21 wants to see the end of single-family homes and the destruction of the nuclear family. All I'm saying is, the removal of private property rights is a dangerous step in that direction. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's take a look at this new 2022 census form, which is available for you to peruse at the cso.ie website. Questions about your household. How many rooms do you have for use only by your household? Do not count bathrooms, toilets, kitchenettes, utility rooms, consulting rooms, offices, shops, halls, landings, or rooms that can only be used for storage, such as cupboards. Do count all other rooms, such as kitchens, living rooms, bedrooms, studies, and conservatories you can sit in. If 2 rooms have been converted into one, count them as 1 bedroom. Number of rooms. Of which bedrooms? Folks, the state has no right to ask these questions or demand this information. But then again, when people accepted the state violating the sanctity of their private property with COVID lockdown restrictions, regulating the number of people allowed into their homes, they set a precedent in the minds of most normies. This is very concerning. Any information supplied in this census is just going to be used against us. Do you get to ask the same questions of the ruling class? How many bedrooms in Micheál Martin or Leo Varadkar's homes? How many holiday homes does the average well-to-do sitting TD own? How many bedrooms in those houses? Heck, how many bedrooms in the many mansions of the likes of Bill Gates? How many houses does that fucker own? Nah, we won't be asking those kinds of questions. This is just for the proles. The most powerful people on the planet will not be held to the same standard as the rest of us. Here's more questions. What is the main type of fuel used by the central heating in your accommodation? Does your accommodation use any of the following renewable energy sources? What type of piped water supply does your accommodation have? What type of sewerage facility does your accommodation have? How many cars or vans are owned or are available for use by one or more members of your household? What type of internet connection does your household have? If connected, which devices access the internet in your household? How do you usually travel to work, school, college, or childcare? What time do you usually leave home? How long does your journey take? What time do you usually leave work, school, college, or childcare? The fact that the census is mandatory for people to fill in is bad enough. But these questions, I believe, are a gross violation of personal privacy. Why do people carry on accepting this kind of crap? If the referendum on housing passes, which I suspect it will, because Joe Normie has proven he's unable to resist the power of sustained media propaganda and emotional manipulation, then I want to make it clear, if you take refugees into your home, those refugees will have rights in your home. Consider what's going on right now. Pfizer has released a report outlining 9 pages of adverse events from the jabs, which is essentially going unreported in the mainstream media because right now we're all being deliberately distracted by the contrived Ukraine-Russia war. How many Irish people are going to be extremely sick in the not-so-distant future and really unable to fight what's coming down the line as a result? How many of them will die? Consider an ageing community in any given Dublin suburb, filled with houses of elderly couples who have raised their children, some of them even living alone because their spouse has died. So their children have long since left the nest. So there's spare bedrooms in these houses. Will these elderly people be pressured into housing Ukrainian refugee families in these homes? Which they will no longer own, of course, because the state will have seized these homes? And how long before these elderly people are simply moved on to smart city apartments, pods in the cities, and their homes are seized by the state and given to immigrants? Given to immigrants to live in. The state will, of course, still own the physical buildings. You spend your entire life paying off your death grip mortgage only to have the state seize your assets and hand them over to whoever they want in the winter of your years. European nations had some of the highest jab uptakes on the planet. We already know that there has been a long-term plan in place to replace Europeans with non-Europeans. A paranoid person might think that COVID jabs and this mass migration of people caused by this contrived war narrative were somehow connected. And many third world nations, for example, have among some of the lowest uptakes of the jab. Oh, why, here's a totally crazy notion. How many elderly people are having their lives shortened by the jabs to make room for their replacements? Ha, what a daft notion. How many young Irish people have been made sterile to make room for their fertile and non-Irish replacements? That's just crazy talk. Forget I said it. Furthermore, whatever happened to COVID? Why aren't Irish people concerned about Ukraine's relatively low vaccination rate? Here's a Time.com article from March 2nd, 2022. Why Ukraine's COVID-19 problem is everyone's problem. Just before the invasion on February 24th, only 35% of the Ukrainian population had been vaccinated. Just 35%, you say? On March 5th, RT News posted the following. Requirement for COVID certs and passenger locator forms for those arriving into the country will end from midnight as part of the government's efforts to make it easier for Ukrainian refugees to enter Ireland. That's very generous of them. Amazing how a deadly, deadly pandemic can suddenly be switched off because it's being usurped by a narrative that appears to be more important. All the COVID restrictions just get thrown out the window because it's suddenly really important for Ireland to take in a gargantuan amount of new arrivals. But then again, Joe Normie has proven that he's totally unreachable and cannot be reasoned with. He's already forgotten about jab passports and Omicron and Delta, whatever. The media tells him what to care about today. It tells him who to fear, hate, love, trust. Joe Normie is almost like some kind of biosynthetic robot who receives instructions and acts accordingly, shit in, shit out, that kind of thing, regardless as to whether the information he is receiving contradicts instructions he received the previous week. Today, the center of his world is standing with Ukraine and hating on Putin and Russia. Next month, it could be something entirely different. But what Joe Normie never understands is that ultimately everything that's going on, everything on his television that he's being told to freak out about, is just a series of psyops that have nothing to do really with Ukraine or Russia, just like the previous 2 years had nothing to do with COVID or a pandemic. These are merely distractions and mind-altering events that control Joe Normie's life, impoverish him, and take away his freedoms. With the obvious caveat that that's not to turn a blind eye to the suffering of people in war-torn countries, But our governments have proven time and time again that they don't serve our interests. They don't care about their people, let alone their people's suffering. They care about managing crises created by their globalist masters that they can use to exploit in order to gain more wealth, power and control. And if suffering and conflict is the outcome of such crises, they really couldn't care less about that. Ireland has an alarmingly high jab uptake of about 90%, something like that, while Ukraine's is extremely low by comparison at 35%. But of course, Joe Normie's fear of the unjabbed plays second fiddle to his opportunity to virtue signal about standing with Ukraine and waving the yellow and blue flag. The price of absolutely everything is about to skyrocket, including basic necessities like food, and an energy crisis is being created, but Joe Normie thinks he's fighting Putin, so it's all fine. His rights and freedoms were taken away from him for the past 2 years, and he took a poison in his arm that may have sterilized him or reduced his lifespan by giving him AIDS, and there's no telling how many people have died from it already, but it's fine because he was fighting the fake COVID pandemic. My 2019 past self could never have believed just how gullible the masses actually are. Make no mistake, we stand to lose everything here because of the collective compliance of most people. The cabal have proven they can whip up the public back into a frenzy and bring them completely under control once again by creating another manufactured crisis that seriously impacts upon their quality of life while simultaneously bearing the consequences of the previous manufactured crisis, i.e. the effects of the COVID jabs. I can't predict just how long the worst of the economic collapse will take to truly set in and how long before they can completely bring people to their knees. But if it's a few months or a few short years from now, will anyone care at that point that they no longer own their own home because the government has essentially robbed them of their private property rights? Will anyone care about the fact that COVID was actually a fake pandemic? Will anyone care about any of these details when they're too busy worrying about basic survival, food, keeping warm, covering their bills, etc.? Principles and ideals, like human rights and freedoms, don't mean much to people because such things don't pay the bills. More and more people are going to find themselves at the mercy of the state and entirely dependent on their government for not only basic things that they need to survive, but for their permission to access them. There is a controlled economic collapse taking place all around us, and it's providing fertile ground for a totalitarian nightmare. The people will be brought to the brink of utter and complete catastrophe, only to be offered a last-minute solution in the usual Hegelian fashion. And that solution, which has long been in the works, will be the end of all human freedom in the form of the Great Reset and all of the various machinations and details that follow. Digital currencies that will enable control of our spending, carbon scores, the rationing of everything we use, a China-style social credit system, and the long-term plans of Agenda 21-2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which has always been technocratic serfdom for the masses. The globalists have managed to get as far as they have with their agenda by firstly making the public consent to surrendering their rights and freedoms for more security, and secondly by creating one Hegelian dialectic after another, whereby people can be gradually and incrementally nudged in a particular direction because all other avenues and choices are either too painful or simply cut off from them. The Great Reset has ultimately been about resetting most of humanity back to a kind of feudal system in terms of quality of living. It's about destroying a century of social mobility and economic prosperity that the working and middle class had achieved in the Western world, hitting the reset button on all of that and returning to a period of servitude and poverty for most people. Population control and reduction are likely two other key aspects of their plan in the long term. The elite are drowning us in problems, social divisions, economic turmoil, chaos, and uncertainty. All the while, our money is being made worthless and a truly hideous future is being prepared for us. Now, to any rational mind, I suppose despair is an entirely understandable and reasonable feeling at this point. As we have failed to galvanize any serious resistance to all of this amongst the general population, I also don't think it's possible to wake up most people anyway. You either get this stuff or you don't. You either believe that principles and values like freedom, personal choice, basic human rights are worth dying for, or you don't. The problem is that most people accept their status as a subject of someone or something throughout their entire life, be that a state, government, monarchy, or a corporation. It's always been like this, unfortunately. Whereas some of us understand that no one and nothing has the right to treat us like their property. Take the census, for example. You can be prosecuted for not completing it. That's insanity. What gives anyone the right to demand that I answer their questions, or else suffer financial penalties or some kind of conviction? What gives the government the right to know my personal business or anything about my home or how I go about my daily life? Unfortunately, the Irish people, and indeed people across Europe, have been softened up to communitarian, authoritarian and communistic thinking for many decades now, so they appear to be amenable to such state intrusion into their lives. Nevertheless, the question still stands. What gives the government or state the right? Who is harmed if I do not comply? What damage will I have done? Well, obviously no one is harmed, and I will have caused no damage. In other words, what is immoral or unethical about not filling in the census form? And I'm not only talking about a census form here. There's other things we could talk about, like certain taxes, for example, which are obviously unjustified and a gross violation of our property rights, like, for example, the property tax. But let's just focus on the census for now, because it's an example of the docility of people and their everyday willingness to comply with outright authoritarianism. And I'm not exaggerating, it is authoritarianism. What is the moral or ethical justification to demand that I complete the form? Especially when the details of my personal life collected on the form may be used against me in devious, immoral, and unethical ways in the future. The truth is, there isn't any such moral or ethical justification, and there's certainly nothing morally or ethically wrong with me not completing it. The problem is that this has nothing to do with morals or ethics, because such concepts are the domain of principles and values, and we don't live in a time where principles and values hold much water with people, because again, such things do not pay the bills, and Joe Normie does not understand concepts that operate outside of the realm of the tangible and the practical. If he did, we would have seen revolutions against increasing levels of government overreach across the West many, many years ago. The reason the government believes it can demand that you complete the census form and reveal personal and intimate information about your life or the details of your living accommodations is because it's the law. The law doesn't have to be moral, ethical, fair, reasonable, proportionate, or even in the service of the general public or the individual. It is the law. It is final, arbitrary, and if it is backed by sufficient physical force, it can do and enforce whatever the hell it wants with impunity. It is merely a tool of the state to control the masses. I suppose the second choice, besides despair at the present situation, is to simply take a step back from everything, including the concerns of this world and this time we live in, and consider life in a broader, more philosophical perspective. No matter how tyrannical and unpleasant the situation becomes, at some point we are all going to die. Now, that's not meant to depress you. In fact, it's meant to place a limitation upon the degree to which you experience despondency and anxiety about the future. All we can do with the time we have from cradle to the grave is to live each day of our lives with as much dignity and joy as can be possible within whatever set of circumstances we find ourselves. Major world-shaping events are moving now well beyond our control, and their impacts upon our lives are and will continue to be significant for some time to come. All any single individual can do in the face of that is to find like-minded people to share the burden with, support each other, and build, to whatever degree possible, a means of navigating and reducing the worst of the negative effects of all of this and maximizing any opportunities that may arise along the way. We're only passing through this life, so while we are here, we will engage in whatever small acts of defiance we can each day. When literal tyranny knocks on our door, we will all be faced with the choice of dying on our feet or living on our knees. And I can tell you this, I won't be living on my knees. Thank you very much for watching. If you'd like to support my work, you can do so via the links below. Take care, please share this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.